Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Harry Harris.
Thanks, Bob. When Jane invited me over, she said, just come over, have dinner, give a little talk if you want, but mainly just come and enjoy an evening with the ANZEC chapter. So I said, brilliant, perfect, I won't give a talk, I'll just come and eat your food and drink your wine. She said, well, maybe just a little talk. I said, well, what if I just show a video? And she said, maybe a video and a little talk. So I'm giving a little talk and showing a video that we made following this expedition, because my real passion in life is that I want to grow up to be a documentary filmmaker, and this is one of the first little films we've actually managed to put together, although I'm obviously aspiring to greater things, and having seen some of the stuff earlier on from the Australian ARC project, I probably wish I'm not showing my video now, but anyway. So this expedition, really, the main reason I want to talk about it is because it actually is the trip I've done, of all the trips I've done over my lifetime of cave exploration, this is the trip that has put me most outside my personal comfort zone, to the point where I would say that from a personal point of view, this expedition was actually a pretty massive failure. I didn't actually achieve the goals that I wanted to, because I found myself in an environment where I was extraordinarily uncomfortable, to the point where I was unable to achieve my personal goals. And that was a bit of a, from a personal ego and morale point of view, that was a bit of a wake-up call for me. This is early part of 2020, so I'm kind of probably on the latter half of my expedition career, I would say, at this stage, at the age of 57 now. And so it was a bit of a shock to suddenly realise I was way out of my depth. And the reason I was out of my depth was that I was in the Rocky Mountains of Canada in the middle of winter, in temperatures of the minus 20 to minus 30, camping in a cave which had those sort of temperatures in the entrance, where we were living and sleeping for a couple of weeks. And I just was finding that day by day I was getting colder and colder and more miserable, more and more sleep deprived, because I couldn't be warm at night, to the point where I started to feel sick, and then I couldn't eat, and I got into this sort of vicious spiral of deterioration where I wasn't able to sort of do what I was there to do. And that was a bit of a shock. So this expedition is worthy of talking about, because I think we need to talk about our successes as much as our failures, or the other way around. Anyway, the cave itself is an extraordinary place, and exploration is very much ongoing. So the name of the cave is Castleguard Cave, and in North America it is an iconic site, and cavers and cave divers from around the world know about this site. And I should have known that it was going to be a challenge when I spoke to Rick Stanton, the famous British cave diver who was involved in the Thai cave rescue, obviously. When I said to Rick, I'm thinking about going to Castleguard, and he went, ooh, that's a bit of a cave. That's a bit of an undertaking. And I went, oh, really? Do you think I'm up to it? And he went, I don't know. So I went, oh, well, we'll give it a go. And I was actually over in Canada the year before with a guy called Tom Crisp, who's a well-known New Zealand, English New Zealand, now Canadian caver and cave diver, and my old friend Craig Challen. And we were doing some fantastic cave diving in a similar area, but in summer, so it was much nicer. And we got talking to the locals about Castleguard Cave, and after an evening drinking maple rye whiskey, we got convinced to come back and do this expedition to Castleguard Cave. So this is the story of that trip, and it was right at the start of the COVID pandemic. So hope there's no epileptics in the audience right now. So Castleguard Cave, you fly to Calgary, and you have to go there in winter, because in summer the cave has floodwaters coming through it, and so it's a very dangerous place to be. But in winter everything is frozen solid, and so it's a safe, relatively safe environment. So it's in the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, and it's a bit of an epic chore to just get to the entrance to the cave. So to kind of show you where we are, you drive from a little town called Canmore for about 2 hours on this back road, and you reach this big kink in the road here called Big Bend, and you get out of the car and you put your skis on, and then you ski up the Saskatchewan Glacier. Now, I'm not a glacier guy. I'm not even a snow guy. I've just spent my whole life in the desert in South Australia, and you know, flat, brown is sort of my thing. Tall and white is not something I'm really used to. So just so you don't think I was reckless in this undertaking, Craig and I went out to the Kosciuszko area the August beforehand and did 4 days of backcountry skiing and camping, thus preparing ourselves for the mountains of Canada. And I think it's that can-do attitude that everyone in this room would understand, that you're not going to let something like, you know, lack of mountain experience stop you getting to a cave that you're keen to explore. So anyway, we ski up the Saskatchewan Glacier and then up this thing here, which is the moraine, which is, there's a whole lot of new words, there's a whole vocabulary for mountains that I didn't know about. The moraine is the very steep side of the glacier, so you have to go up this pretty much vertical slope over the top and then down onto this beautiful, beautiful thing called the Meadows, which is pretty much flat all the way across here. And then you ski down pretty steep sort of valleys and through these pine forests down to the entrance of Castleguard Cave. So it's 20 kilometres basically from the car to the entrance to the cave. And if it's a good day, good conditions, it's a 1-day trip. If it's bad conditions, deep snow, then it can take 3 days. So slightly nervous about this part of the trip. And then you get to the entrance to the cave, and this is what it looks like in winter basically. Beautiful big cavern. There's 20 kilometres of tunnels inside this entrance, and it's very remote obviously, so no one really goes there. The cave is gated. About 20-30 metres back from the entrance there's a big, like a prison gate with a lock on it, so you can't get into the cave unless you've got the key. We were camping just inside this area here. Now the temperature outside was mainly sort of -20, -25. Just inside it's more like -15, so not a big problem. Now this video shows, this is from National Parks camera taken over a 12-month period, and you can see we're still in the winter period now, and shortly you'll see the snow start to subside as summer arrives, and then you'll see these pulses of water come out of the cave entrance. And so intermittently with the glacial melt and rain, this cave will suddenly flood, and really suddenly and unpredictably. And so they learnt very much the hard way in the 60s that you cannot go caving in this place in summer, because these flood pulses can happen at any time. And they had some very, very near misses, you know, exploring this cave early on. And there's an amazing history of Canadian and primarily British expedition exploration of this site. So this is the cave. Oh, sorry, I've snipped the bottom off, but the cave entrance is down here, and you can see this thing goes all the way under the, that's Mount Castleguard there. The glacier that we came up is just here. So this cave goes for about 15 kilometres, you know, in a linear fashion with these big branching passages. And up here, there's these sort of dips in the snow apparently, where if you're on the surface, you see these great big hollows that clearly are funneling down into the cave. And in the cave itself at the far end, you find these big ice plugs coming down into the terminus of the cave. They're quite extraordinary looking things. But the bit we're interested in, and the reason we've been invited to be part of this expedition, is this blue line here, because this is a sump in the cave. Inside the cave, even in winter, it's more like 2 to 3 degrees temperature, and so everything is melted further into the cave. And at this point here, there's a British guy called Martin Groves who had been exploring this sump. He'd been diving in there by himself with a rebreather, a chest mount rebreather, homemade of course, being British. And he had explored this sump for nearly 900 metres, and he'd gotten to the end on his second trip there in about 2011. And he'd gotten to the end and he'd had some equipment problems. He had a leaking glove. The water's about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. Leaking glove, one of the oxygen cells in his rebreather was malfunctioning, and he very wisely decided not to get out of the water and take all his equipment off and go exploring in the dry cave beyond. And so he returned saying there's more cave to be found. And if you look at the way that tunnel is trending, you could well imagine there could easily be another 10 or more kilometres of cave to find, if it's going to follow the same pattern. So for cave explorers, this is a huge attraction. And that's what lured us to the site. So he had predicted this red line, basically. He said in his mind, this is what's going to happen inside this cave, and someone's got to go back and explore it. So Craig and I and Tom were enlisted for this task. Just to show you what the place is like on the way to the cave. I mean, I haven't done a lot of this stuff, but it's just exquisitely beautiful. This blue ice, and there'll be many of you in this audience who, focus on this kind of terrain for their pastimes. But for me, this is just like the most extraordinary place I've ever seen. Really, really beautiful. But the Canadians, of course, this is their backyard. They feel so comfortable in this environment. There's little avalanches going off everywhere, and I'm going, I'm just like hyper vigilant the whole time. Is the mountain going to fall on me? Is a bear going to jump out of a hole? I was frightened. I've never felt so frightened of everything. It all just was so foreign to me. This is the view from the entrance to the cave. So this is kind of the backyard, and if you can stop shivering for long enough to look at it, it is extraordinary. Now, we had a lot of heavy diving equipment, and we knew that we had to pay one helicopter flight to take the equipment in. And so Craig and I, with some selfish interest invested in this, decided that we would offer to pay for the helicopter, but we would also jump in the helicopter so that we didn't have to do that ski on the way in. Because to be honest, I was more petrified about the skiing up the glacier for 20 k's. And having seen Craig attempt to ski, at least I've been skiing before. Craig had never even been before we went to Mount Kosciuszko, and he twisted his knee on the first day and then started walking around in snowshoes. So I knew we were in big trouble if we had to go up there. So we paid for the helicopter. We flew in and landed with all the heavy diving equipment. But unfortunately, as you'll see, we couldn't escape the skiing expedition on the way home, which was a bit of an epic for us. So this is home sweet home for this 12 days in the cave, and yeah, the floor is just ice in the cave. So again, I just could not get warm and happy. I was not a happy boy. The food, that's Craig. Now Craig's actually been to the Andes Mountains. He didn't sort of tell me this, that he'd been in the snow in high altitude mountains before. So he had all these proper coats and jackets and stuff, and I just had my clothes on. And, I should have got a bit more local advice perhaps. But when you see the locals preparing dinner like this, I should have twigged that there was problems here in terms of. And the other secret I learned was the Canadians stave off the cold by adding, bags and bags of chili into all the food. And I actually cannot eat chili at all. I'm a spice wimp. So not only was I starving to death, none of the food that was available was in any way palatable to me. So the whole thing was a disaster from my perspective. And everyone's so happy sitting around the camp fire, just so warm all the time. You can't even have a drink of water because your water bottle is frozen the moment you sort of pick it up. It's just a miserable place. The cave to get to the sump is it's only about 600 metres, but it's a mixture of vertical stuff, and there's these huge icy spike things that are threatening to fall off the ceiling and impale themselves in your head all the time. And then worse still, later on in the cave, there's two big challenges. The first one is called the ice crawls, which is basically the ice on the floor goes up and down with almost day by day. And some days it's like this, close to the roof, and some days it's like this. And as you'll see in the video, many years in a row, this part of the cave is unpassable because it's just too close to the ceiling. And that goes for about 400 metres. So you go through and you take some tools with you in case it comes up a little bit during the day. And one day I came back out of the cave, those tools which were just left on the floor were now an inch under the ice. I thought, great, not only has the ice come up, but all the tools are underneath the ice as well. It felt very, very perilous. So this is the start of the ice crawls, and you'll see a bit more of that in the video. This is Martin Groves with his homemade rebreather. I mean, he's an extraordinary explorer. He did a lot of this, solo, as I mentioned. You know, the caves, it's not beautiful, but there's a few sort of formations and things in there. But the second big challenge in this cave is these long passages of that are only about, the roof is about this high off the floor. So you have to either crawl or even, you know, G.I. Joe on your belly, but you also have to push scuba tanks and stuff along for 600 metres on this very rocky floor. So again, just very hard work. But further into the cave, where the Canadians were going, they went all the way to the far end. They were, you know, they were in all sorts of interesting types of passage and some really beautiful formations further into the cave. But some pretty deadly stuff as well. They were, you know, very athletic bunch of very fit cavers, these Canadians. But you know, there's about, you know, 5 metre drop down there, so it's fairly, you know, very remote place to have a fall and have an injury. Yeah, so not for me, that stuff. I like a rope to be attached to me, and you can see this girl's not very pleased. She's only about 4 feet high, so she was really struggling to do that bridging across those rifty bits in the cave. And that's one of these ice plugs at the very far end of the cave where, you know, where these depressions in the snow are. So this is the sump. This is the start of the dive. So the Canadians helped us get all the dive gear through there and then left us to it while they all disappeared up the far end of the cave. They went in there for 6 days just with a little bag of, I don't know what they had, just a little bit of chocolate bars and, I don't know, concrete to make themselves tougher. And then they came back out to see how we'd fared. So yeah, interesting environment. So I'm going to stop there and show you this video, the epic film of the expedition, and then we'll come back for some questions. How amazing is it looking down at the rocks on the riverbed?
Just follow the channel, it's going to meander back and forth.
Yeah.
I'm going to be just in front of you, so
Let's go.
at whatever distance. All right, buddy, let's give her hell. Take chest bit here. Not bad, just wriggle a little bit. Oh, God.
Yesterday.
Thank you, ladies.
The sump is beautiful. We highly recommend it.
I didn't think I had a chance in hell, but these boys have been cutting a trench for 48 hours solid. Chainsaws, picks, shovels, whatever.
So we're ready for a dive today. So we got about a kilometre further after this, and we should be at the water. We spent 2 days sawing a section out with a chainsaw. It's about -20 outside, and everything's frozen. It then starts getting very low, kind of almost bedding plane-ish type passage where it's a lot more crawling and grovelling with your pack, and it just carries on that way and carries on that way and carries on that way, and it's absolutely grueling trying to get gear up to the sump. There's a few other little rock squeezes on the way which are kind of entertaining because you kind of roll your bag out in front of you and then you squeeze through and then follow it down, and all the floor is just sharp kind of bouldery rocks, so your knees take an absolute pounding, so do your elbows.
Well, I think we're going pretty well. This is early stage in the big foray to the other side of the sump, and we're making pretty good time through the dry section, so I think we'll be maximum 2 hours here, which is a pretty handy schedule. It'll be great if we can get this day over in 10 hours or so.
Eventually you pop out towards the sump and it just opens up, so you can actually stand up. There's a good platform there that we can gear up on.
That sounds like a great plan.
The sump itself is a fissure that drops down to the water and seems to carry on out towards the back wall, and you can see just this huge shaft descending. from Martin Grove's reports, should go down to about 20 metres before we then pop out into more phreatic passage, which slowly starts coming back up to the surface after roughly a kilometre of underwater section. It was a beautiful dive, absolutely stunning. It takes about 50 minutes to swim from one side to the other. Just big passage, you drop down the 20-metre shaft.
Okay, I'll just find a spot where you can pass me.
And then we broke out into the clear water as soon as we hit the horizontal going passage, and it just slowly kind of creeps its way back up from 20 metres up until the surface on the other side.
So the dive itself was really pleasant. I was actually surprised that the line that's been laid in there quite some years ago is still in really good shape. When Martin put that through, he did a pretty good job. It's quite securely laid. But because we'd been told that the floods go through this sump, I expected that it would be ripped apart and we'd have multiple line repairs to do. It was only, as it turns out, broken in 2 places, and the first place it had obviously been chafing on a rock and gradually worn through. So there was a bit of slack in the line, managed to pull the ends together and tie them together. It was broken in another place as well, and we jumped past that pretty quickly. As a result of that, we really have some doubt about whether the flood that floods this cave, the bulk of the water comes through this sump, because I would have expected after all these years and that amount of flow every season that the shape the line was in would be a lot worse than this. The current theory of where the water comes from may need to be revised on that basis.
Yeah, there's really not a lot of evidence of big floodwaters coming out through that sump passage. I mean, where you get geared up, there's a clay bank up there which looks like it's there's been water that drips on top of it, and it basically runs downwards. Whereas if the sump was actually flooding, what it would do is it would push out in the opposite direction and smooth out all of that clay. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that, and even the far side of the sump as well. There's a small little stream that kind of trickles into it, but again, there's no real sign of huge floodwaters that come through there. There's not really any scalloping on the walls or anything like that.
So on the far side of the sump, the information that we had previously from Martin Groves was that the sump surfaced and there was quite an open area, easy to get out of the water, and that there was tunnel leading off from that. So we were very excited about this, and that was our chief objective of this whole trip, was to explore that tunnel. So we hopped out of the water. There's a very nice little pool there that's really easy to work in. You can help each other get dekitted and geared up. What we could see from there was this really nice walking passage about 2 metres high and probably 3 metres wide.
At least we're in a spot where we can help each other gear up. Yeah. The most remote dive I've ever done. Yeah, this or the third sump of Cockerby. Right, well, it's a walking passage, Tom. I
I headed up there first for just a little bit of an explore, Unfortunately, after about 30 metres, it narrows down to this rift passage. I proceeded up that, but it was really getting a little bit hairy to go up there in a dry suit, because I was very concerned about tearing the dry suit or damaging it somehow sitting down on a sharp bit of rock. And so abandoned that, came back to where Tom was, and we started a survey just with the idea of surveying as far as we could reasonably, just to get an idea of what direction it's heading in. It's certainly heading straight, and my impression is it's going upwards a bit as well. There was a little tiny stream flowing in the bottom, so definitely water flows down here, but as we mentioned before, there's some doubt because of the formations that are in there, some pretty fragile formations, whether the full flood comes through there. So we surveyed up there about 60 metres or so, and then we thought, well, it's really a little bit dangerous here, because if we do tear a dry suit, then we're in all sorts of trouble for the trip out. So we turned around and headed home.
We ended up surveying only about 60 metres of passage before we decided it was probably a bit too gnarly to be doing in dry suits. Happy to be back this side of the sump and still leaving big open passage on the other side ready to go back to and take some proper caving gear for.
I think 16 people hauled and participated on this trip. There was probably 5 people supporting us down below. There's years when you just can't access it. It just seals right off. This year it didn't seal right off, but it was narrow. You're trying to arrange with all these volunteer people to come and work for free. So you're trying to offer them a rewarding experience. The sump lead was sitting there for 10 years prior. Like, it's an awesome lead, but it's so challenging logistically.
That's a long way down.
I think it is a small group of people who have the passion to put in the hard yards. There's plenty of people around the world who'd be capable, but lining up all the things that made this successful, including permits, the ice crawls, the climate, all the things that had to fall into place to make this what is actually a relatively straightforward dive, to make that possible, it's actually an enormous undertaking. And I'm not unhappy with the result, to be honest. I think the fact that we established that there is cave continuing beyond that sump is a significant achievement.
I love all of you people, but I didn't buy the best cut of meat for you. It's the cheap shit. So we have to cook it more carefully. And you'll eat it you'll eat it medium rare like a man.
What did you have to do to become part of the wet mules?
I'd rather not talk about it.
This is for the inevitable investigation that's to follow.
Well, there will be fatalities.
Yep.
They became clear during the barbecue when people started to perish from various types of injuries, including alcohol poisoning, barbecue burns, salt and pepper seasoning, and other various maladies.
We were looking at that the other day. There, like where it changes from that rifty passage into the subway. It's just like.
And therefore,
My animal husbandry is definitely laughing.
Record?
Start again.
Okay.
How confident are you it was a bat?
Oh, I know my bad shit.
I think that was the story, wasn't it?
So an honest portrayal of an expedition, I would say, and all its failings. Any questions?
Explain how a rebreather works, please. I noticed there was
Right, well that's a big question. Well, a rebreather basically, instead of exhaling bubbles into the water, like a normal scuba tank, you actually exhale back into the machine and it goes around in a circle, removes the carbon dioxide in your exhaled breath, adds a bit of oxygen back into the unit, into the respiratory cycle, and round and round it goes. So you don't have to exhale bubbles unless you ascend and the gas in the rebreather expands and has to be vented somehow. So it's a very efficient way of diving, and so a small rebreather like that chest-mounted one that you saw in the video, with a small cylinder of oxygen, just a couple of litres, can last for 5 hours instead of, you know, a single scuba tank, which in that cave would have lasted 1 hour at best. So when you have to carry all that stuff through a cave in very difficult conditions, it's much lighter, more efficient, and it's really the only way to be able to explore those sort of very remote kind of diving locations.
Would you do it again?
Look, it's funny how the pain wears off and you think, yeah, I'd go back there now. I think I'd be a lot better prepared, I'd be a lot fitter, and I would be better dressed. I'd stick to my snowshoes because I know I can safely walk rather than try and ski down those up and down bits.
Okay, next question. Why?
Come on, nobody in this room should ever ask that question, Valerie.
I have that question.
Harry, what was your very first dive?
My first dive was as about a 13-year-old boy being lowered off the side of my parents' boat on the end of a hooker to get oysters and scallops for them while they sat up on top drinking gin and tonic and throwing the empty shells back overboard. So I kind of grew up with a bad crowd, but I did my course when I was about 15 years old, and so my first proper dive, if you like, under instruction was just one of the reefs off Adelaide, I think. Yeah.
John.
So clearly claustrophobia is not in your dictionary. What makes you different from us who don't suffer claustrophobia?
Well, I have to say that dry caving through very tight places where you actually have to exhale to move through, because it makes your chest smaller, and you have to take your helmet off so that you can turn your head sideways to fit through, because your head with a helmet on is bigger than most other parts of you. I find that frighteningly claustrophobic. I hate it. But strangely, if I'm underwater and you remove gravity from the equation, so you don't feel that weight or that pressure on your chest, then I find I'm completely comfortable, because you can actually just move with your fingers, pulling yourself along if you're neutrally buoyant. And if it's too tight, I mean, there are certainly underwater caves where you have to do that thing where you have to exhale to move forwards. But you know, it's very easy to push yourself backwards if you get stuck, whereas in a dry cave, it can be really hard to push yourself out of that. So I find dry caving much more claustrophobic and still quite frightening. That stuff was terrifying for me.
So your colleague that went solo years before, in 2011, what happens if he got stuck? How would he get out?
Yep, excellent question. Wait till summer and surf out. Yeah.
Gordo.
What was the water temperature?
3 to 4 degrees. Yeah.
Oh, warm.
Yeah.
How did you find getting out of the dry still got back? Did the tent feel really warm?
In the end, I didn't actually dive. 2 reasons. Firstly, I was in such a state of disrepair, I decided that I wasn't feeling up to it. But secondly, and this was my excuse, one of the 3 rebreathers got damaged on the way through. So I said, Tom, you take mine. You take mine, mate.
Oh, very magnanimous.
It was magnanimous of me. You know, I'm actually quite proud of myself for saying, you know what, I'm not up to diving at the moment. I'm not strong enough, and you know, the last thing you want to become is a liability to the rest of the team, because dragging someone out of the back of that cave who are disabled, hypothermic, whatever, just, you know, it's a massive undertaking. So you don't want to be that guy.
What were you sort of telling yourself to keep going?
Well, I started to really struggle. I was really at the end of my tether on that trip. Towards the sort of 3/4 the way through point, I was ready to say, call the helicopter, I want to go home. But knowing that you can't let the other guys down, I guess. And it's quite, that was the first time that had really happened to me on a trip, where I just felt like I just cannot do this. And that was very confronting for me. I really struggled with it. And to actually tell the other guys that, you know what, I don't want to dive because I'm just feeling too weak, too cold, too sick, too hungry. I've just lost my strength. I really struggled with that. And, you're surrounded by blokey blokes, and not all of them are very receptive to that sometimes. So, it's challenging. And I think it just reminded me that you don't want to be one of those guys who is disparaging to the team member who's struggling. You've just got to look after them and say, it's all right, sit it out, mate. Stay in your sleeping bag for a day. Doesn't matter. We're on holidays. That'd be my approach. And you don't always get that. So
You exited into the middle of the lockdown pandemic, full force. Was that a bit of a struggle for your recovery then?
Honestly, it felt like the apocalyptic movie. We came out of this cave, 12 days underground, literally, and came out. Finally got into phone reception. Got all these text messages from my wife saying, "Get on a plane. You've got to come home. Australia is threatening to close its borders." And I was going, "What? I mean, that's impossible." As if they're not going to let an Australian citizen back into the Australian of the Year, back into the country. That's impossible. But if we'd left it an extra day, we would have been stuck in Canada for I don't know how many months. So she was quite right. And going home was bizarre. Like Calgary Airport, we saw one other passenger. And even Dallas, we saw like 20 other people in the airport. It was really weird. So yeah, strange time.
Deborah.
How does the fear factor compare to like Thailand, for example, where there was zero fear?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, underwater is my very comfortable environment compared to even the dry caves. So as soon as I'm underwater, I feel happy and relaxed, and I don't care if it's zero visibility or crystal clear. It's just, I've done it for so many years that it's become normal even. And in your training doing cave diving, you do train a lot in zero visibility and conditions. And even if it's not zero visibility, you've got a blindfold on for half of your training. So you don't actually get to see the caves at all. So the training is very robust, which is important because you need to be ready for those situations where someone's kicked up the silt or there's suddenly a bit of a flood in the cave and the visibility disappears or your lights fail, and you need to be able to happily follow your piece of string all the way out of a cave, no matter how long that takes. And that actually, strangely enough, can become enjoyable with experience and time. It's like a puzzle to solve. And as long as you know you've got enough air to breathe, it's not much, there's no stress, you just got to follow the process. So when it came to diving in Thailand, which was absolute zero visibility, it was no point even turning a torch on, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Because we had this amazing thick climbing rope all the way through the cave that the British divers had laid, I felt completely safe in that cave. I wasn't worried about the cave diving per se in that event. It was this moral imperative for the lives of these boys that was the frightening thing. And that was enough to distract from any of the physical kind of threats in the cave. I mean, we wouldn't normally dive in a cave that is actively flooding. It's not really safe. But once we'd done it for a couple of days, I realised that it was okay. It was sort of passable. So, yeah. And, I do a lot of corporate speaking now and a lot of speaking to charities and things. And the thing I emphasise to the crowd is that, for most of you who are listening to this story, you'll be thinking about, I'm so frightened about the description of the cave and the cave diving. But remember, that's what we do for fun on the weekends. For us, it was all about those boys. That was the scary thing. It's like a climber doing a climb, or the Canadians in those mountains. That's just normal for them. But for me, that was the terrifying thing. So it's whatever you're used to. That's not courage, that's just familiarity.
Sarah?
I probably should know the answer to this question, but do you know what parts are going to be liquid versus frozen?
Yeah, so the cave gets slowly warmer the further in you go, and the ice crawls become slowly wetter as you get through them. So at the far end of the ice crawls, about 400 metres into them, you start to notice a bit of water on the surface of the ice, and then it becomes slushy and boggy, and that's why you end up wet in your caving suit, which is bad because, of course, as soon as you stop, everything freezes, and when you come out especially, you get the caving suit off and get dry and warm, and the next morning the thing's like cardboard, and you have to stomp all over it to break all the ice to put it back on again. It's horrendous. There's nothing to recommend it. Nothing. Just the bragging rights. That's what we call type 2 fun. Everyone in this room, again, will know about type 2 fun. It's the type of fun you talk about in the pub afterwards.
Everyone, please join me in thanking. What a great presentation.